Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are out west. Welcome to the opening session of the Queen's 2020 International Institute on Social Policy. Thank you all very much for joining us. My name is Margaret Biggs, and I will be your moderator today. It is unfortunate that we are not able to meet in person on the Queen's campus this year. Even though we are not on campus, I would like to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities. We're grateful to be able to live and learn on these lands. Before I introduce this session, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items. After our presentation, I will open it for a moderated discussion. And to ask a question, just please use the webinar's Q&A function, the feature that you'll see it at the bottom of your screen. Just type in your question. You can do it at any time. And we may not be able to get to all of your questions, but we will do our best and we will group as many of them as possible. So this is the 25th anniversary of the Queen's Social Policy Conference. For 25 years, Queen's has probed the most pressing social issues facing Canada and other OECD countries. It's carved out a distinctive niche, trying to bridge policy and research and bringing an international and comparative perspective to bear on critical social issues. I think it's fair to say, though, that at no time in the past 2.5 decades has social policy been so front and center and so critical to the future of Canada and other OECD countries. The current crisis has exposed stark inequalities, the precarious nature of work, and the lack of basic social security for many. It has drawn our attention to the social determinants of health, the risks of decoupling economic prosperity from social progress, and the systemic barriers and inequities that many still face. So over the next 3 weeks, in a series of moderated online discussions, we're going to explore the major drivers and social impacts of the current pandemic and economic crisis. We're going to drill down into the implications for some of our most critical building blocks of our social safety net, income security, social protection, labor standards. And we're also going to explore the impacts on social attitudes and values, and ask whether citizens' priorities are shifting and what the implications might be for politics and policy. Today, we're going to kick off the conference with a wide aperture and explore the underlying drivers and dynamics that have fueled the social and economic dimensions of this crisis. Earlier shocks to Western economies of this magnitude spawned a fundamental rethinking of the social order and waves of policy innovation. You only have to think about the Beveridge report in the UK or the Marsh report here in Canada. So the question is, are we now at a similar inflection point? Well, there's really no one better placed to speak to these issues than Professor Daron Acemoglu. Daron is the Institute Professor at M.I.T, and you can read a brief bio in the conference material, but let me just mention a few things. Dr. Acemoglu is a leading academic economist, an elected fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Society of Labor Economists. His academic work covers a wide range of areas, including political economy, economic development, economic growth, inequality, labor economics, and the economics of networks. Here in Canada, Dr. Acemoglu is probably best known for 2 landmark studies that he co-authored with Harvard's James Robinson: Why Nations Fail, Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, and more recently, The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. A few months ago, Dr. Acemoglu wrote a piece in Project Syndicate on the post-COVID state. He wrote that we were collectively at one of the most transformative moments of the last 75 years. So here to talk about this crisis and what it's teaching us and how we move from response to recovery to reset is Dr. Daron Acemoglu.
Thank you, Margaret. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you in this important and troubling time in our history. And I want to share some thoughts on this. And to help with that, let me share my screen first. So the talk I'm going to base my thoughts on is coming from several lines of research that I have been engaged in. And it's entitled Remaking the Post-COVID World, because I think it is not a luxury, but an imperative for us to think about how we can improve the post-COVID world. This isn't just because of the disruptive effects of the pandemic. It's much more because, if anything, the pandemic is an accelerator, a wake-up call for a lot of the trends that have been going on, and many of which have been ignored by us and by our politicians. To highlight, let me show some US data, though many of the patterns I'm going to emphasize are common across the US and many other developed economies, including Canada. So here, as one part of the troubles we are facing before the pandemic hit, I'm showing how labor demand has evolved over the last 70 years. I'm depicting private sector wage bill growth. That means average wage times employment in the private sector. I'm normalizing it by population so that it's not driven by population growth being different across different sub-periods. And on the left, you see how this has evolved over the 4 decades following World War II. It's a remarkable picture how steady and rapid the increase of private wage bill is. It shows that real wage bill growth is about 2.5 percentage points faster than population. And it's pretty steady. What that means is that year in and year out, essentially you're going to have something above 2% real wage growth for workers. Employment is more or less constant, increasing just a little bit over this time period. On the right, you see the same object, but now over the last 3 decades. It's a sea change. First, the growth of wage bill in the private sector slows down, and then it essentially flattens from the late 1990s to today. So for all practical purposes, the private sector is not paying more to labor, it's not hiring that much more, and it's not paying more to the workers that it hires. This has major implications, not least the decline in the labor share in GDP, an important trend in many countries, including Canada and the United States. But even more transformative are its implications for wage inequality. So here I'm showing real wage growth for different demographic groups, in particular different education groups and gender in the United States from 1960s onwards. And it is, again, a sobering picture. What you see is that in the 60s and the early 70s, real wages of pretty much every demographic group, low education, high education, men, women, is growing at that magical 2% real a year. This is fairly shared progress coming with economic growth and lifting pretty much all boats in the US economy. But from sometime in the late 1970s, early 1980s, again, the picture changes radically. First, you see a big fanning out corresponding to much greater inequality in the labor market. But even more consequential for its social implications is that low education groups, for example, the red and the orange, high school dropouts and high school graduates, have seen precipitous declines in their real wages. This is somewhat specific to UK and the US, but similar patterns are true even if the real wage declines are not as extreme in other countries. So essentially in the US, if you're a high school dropout, you are earning about 30% less than your high school dropout parents. So this is a remarkable change, especially for men. This, of course, has deep implications about discontent, political reactions, and is not unrelated to the populist backlash that we are experiencing in the United States. Why has this change taken place? It has many causes, and I'll talk about some of the institutional ones, but my own work has emphasized that technological change, the nature of technology, is also critical. And one way of seeing that is through this picture, which on the left again shows the 4 decades after World War II, and on the right, the last 3 decades. And the two lines, the black and the dotted line, are signifying different types of technologies. The black line is driven by automation technologies that substitute capital for labor, whereas the dotted line is other types of technologies that increase labor productivity. In the 4 decades in which growth was rapid and shared, you see that these two types of technological change were both rapid and they were counterbalancing. And one way of seeing that is that the sum of the two, the thick blue line in the middle, is hovering around 0. But again, the picture changes quite radically in the previous 3 decades. Now, the black line goes up fast. Sorry, the black line goes up slowly, and the dotted line, due to the decline in relative labor demand due to automation, accelerates, so that the sum of the two, the blue line in the middle, is now heading south. That explains a large part of the slowdown in private wage bill growth. Why did this change happen? I will come to it, but we have to understand both its institutional and technological drivers. One way of doing that is look a little bit more into the nature of the technologies that we have put a lot of emphasis over the last several decades. One of them is industrial robotics. Certainly, industrial robots have had an important role in modernizing some sectors and increasing productivity, but when you have a switch from humans to robots, that has come with important costs as well. So here I'm showing what has happened to local labor markets in the United States, where the most number of robots or the greatest exposure to robots has been recorded over the last 2 decades, 2.5 decades. And what you see is that those places where there has been more robot exposure, such as Detroit, because of the car industry, Wilmington, Lansing, Muncie, because of electronics and cars, auto parts, have had the worst employment performance and also the worst wage performance. Industrial robots have reduced labor demand and have led to worse employment outcomes. This is not atypical of other automation technologies. AI, certainly as a technological platform, has the capacity to do many things, including improving the employment experiences and creativity of many workers. But if you look at how AI has been used in the recent few years, where it has already taken off in the United States, is that it has mostly been used for replacing or automating existing tasks. So the question then is, why is it that we are putting all of our eggs in these automation technologies like robots and AI and not in other technologies? And to be clear, what I'm not saying is that there is anything wrong with AI or robots. What's wrong and what's happened that's costly in the US labor market is that we have done just these things and not other technologies. We have neglected increasing the productivity of workers and creating jobs with our technological know-how. Again, this is a complex phenomenon and has many causes. It is certainly not unrelated to the fact that the business models of the largest companies in the United States is based on automation. If you look at the big tech, it is driven by a vision in which machines and algorithms replace workers, and you don't want to have many workers around who are troublesome. Global competition may have contributed. Our education system, which perhaps has not provided the skills that are necessary for new tasks and new activities that we could have developed, are certainly relevant as well. But another aspect of this problem, which emphasizes that there isn't anything inevitable preordained about the path of technology, is that we have actually created some of these problems with our policies. The policy aspects of this are complex, and perhaps I can come back to it in the Q&A session, but I want to emphasize one aspect of it, which is the tax code. So what this picture does is that it shows in the US, and again, the picture is detailed, the details do vary, but the picture is similar across different countries, but the US case is again somewhat instructive and extreme. The US taxes labor much more heavily than capital. So here in this picture, I'm showing the blue in blue, what the effective tax that labor faces because of income taxes and payroll taxes versus taxes on capital and labor, in particular software, equipment, and structures. So one thing to note is that historically, labor has always been taxed much more heavily than capital. But even more noteworthy is that from 2000 onwards, you see a huge decline in the taxes faced by software, the purple, and equipment, the red line. And this is driven by depreciation allowances that essentially allow firms to write off their capital investments, and also various tax evasion strategies that have enabled firms to shift themselves from, say, C corporation to S corporation so that they don't pay corporate taxes. As a result, today, software and equipment which are used for automation are taxed close to zero, while labor is taxed at 25%. What this does is that it encourages firms to adopt and develop automation technologies even when these technologies are not very productive. The post-COVID world is likely to deepen these trends. There is now one more factor encouraging automation: social distancing and vulnerability to the virus. And in fact, most companies report that they are either taking steps to increase automation, or they are saying, more about 40% of them are saying they need to reevaluate the role of automation. Many robotic companies are reporting increased order for robots. Again, one narrative that you will get is that this is inevitable. This is the path of technology, and what technology gets, what technology wants. This is deeply misleading, in my opinion. These are all choices that we make. And the future need not be automated. But if it is automated, then it really restricts our policy options. Of course, the wage declines in the United States are not just due to technology, they're also due to various changes in labor market institutions. The real value of the minimum wage in the United States is down to about 30% what it was 4 decades ago. Collective bargaining power of workers has fizzled. There's very little worker protection. But what can you do on these fronts if you continue with just investing in automation technologies? Not much, because if today in the United States, with the technology path the way it is, if you increase minimum wages or increase the demand for higher wages via other means, firms will be encouraged to automate even more. And other ways of dealing with the problem, such as universal basic income, will not deal with these fundamental problems either. In the parlance of some people, it's not the one that I favor most, but since other people use it, let me use it. The problem is not just redistribution, it's also predistribution, meaning that it is a problem of creating jobs and creating good jobs so that we get wage growth for most workers in the United States, in Canada, in Europe. So we need something more comprehensive, a bigger institutional overhaul. And for that, we have to start with the realization that the future does not need to be fully automated. We, of course, depend on digital technologies for preventing a meltdown of the economy. But in the medium term, if the pandemic exacerbates the trends that I have pointed out, we have already lost the control over our institutions and the control of our ability to create good jobs. But this path is not inevitable, as I pointed out. Companies, societies, via government policies and regulations, we decide how technology is used, its direction, and who benefits from it. There's nothing inevitable about subsidizing capital so that you substitute capital for labor even when it's not warranted by productivity. There is nothing inevitable about letting the technological trajectory of a country or the world being guided by a handful of tech companies that are obsessed with automation. So for this, all of this, we need a new institutional framework to guide us. But as Margaret mentioned at the beginning, there is a lot of precedent for this. We've been at similar junctures where existing institutions were imperfect and shown to be lacking in the face of major challenges. And that's where the original welfare state was created. We might call that welfare state 1.0. We are at a similar point when we need new responsibilities for the state for combating inequality, climate change, pandemics, security, and doing so both in terms of creating an institutional framework where labor is protected, and also redirecting technological change. Because regulation of technology, not just because of automation and wage inequality, but also because what AI implies for democracy, our lives, our social interactions, those are all critical questions that are even deeper than what we faced in previous times. But welfare state 1.0 at its time wasn't any less radical than what we are facing today. In the same way that we need better social safety net and better regulation of companies and technologies, the welfare state 1.0 came in the aftermath of two transformative events in the history of Western world: the Great Depression and World War II. And it came out of a realization that the government needed to play a twin role, both in terms of providing a social safety net and in terms of managing the macroeconomic risks and externalities, effects that various different business strategies and actions, investments created. There is no better symbol of some of these things than the Beveridge report that Margaret mentioned. The Beveridge report wasn't the first, and in some ways it was very comprehensive. In some other ways it's less comprehensive than what we are talking about today. But it is symbolic because it came in the darkest day that the UK was facing in the middle of the war in 1942, by a commission led by Lord Beveridge, William Beveridge, and came up with a template for welfare state 1.0 that had many of the elements that became the hallmarks of the government actions and the social safety net that developed in much of the Western world after World War II. Minimum wages, health insurance, financed by the government, aid for children from poor families, regulations for safety, and various types of progressive taxation measures. And the Beveridge report was a transformative event, not just because it was adopted pretty much wholesale by the Labour government that came to power after World War II, but because it was immediately embraced by the whole British population as a light that was at the end of a dark tunnel. But not everybody was enthused by the Beveridge report. Some people were very concerned, and chief among them was Friedrich von Hayek, a recent emigre from Austria who had fled the Nazis and then teaching at the LSE. Hayek had a complex way of thinking about these problems and wasn't completely opposed to some of the objectives of the Beveridge report, but he was extremely worried about what entrusting the government with much, much greater responsibilities than had been the case before would mean. And in particular, he thought that that would be that would open the way for a new kind of totalitarianism, an idea that he developed in a memo and in a letter and then a memo for William Beveridge, and then became his bestseller, The Road to Serfdom, that still influences the ways in which many people think about government action today. But it turned out that Hayek was wrong. There was wholesale embrace of the types of institutions that the Beveridge report advocated, but in no place in Europe or in North America or even in Japan and parts of Asia where similar institutions were adopted did it lead to any type of totalitarianism. Why not? I think understanding the reason why Hayek's concern did not turn out to be on target is important for us in moving forward. And I think the reason why Hayek was wrong wasn't because his concerns were completely misplaced. It was because he did not see how society would embrace and work with his concerns in various different ways. And that's exactly what Jim Robinson and I try to explore at the end of our new book, The Narrow Corridor, and that's what we call the Red Queen effect. Democracy, liberty, and better governance of markets doesn't come as manna from heaven as a gift or as a result of cleverly designed constitutions and institutions. It comes from the interplay of elites and citizens, of states and societies. And the Red Queen effect, as in Alice in Wonderland, is the process in which society has to run as fast as the responsibilities and the reach of the state in order to be able to balance it out. And that's what we call the narrow corridor, meaning the corridor created where the power of the state and society are balanced. The reason why Hayek was wrong is that he was thinking if the power of the state increases, that's going to take us to despotism because the state is going to be so powerful against society. But the narrow corridor and the Red Queen effect that we advocate says that's not the only path. The alternative path shown by the arrows that go up in this figure is that when society becomes stronger, when state becomes stronger, society can run with it and it can itself become stronger. What does that mean? It means that society becomes more involved in politics. And in fact, starting in Sweden's original experiment with the welfare state, followed by Germany, France, the UK, what we experienced in the post-war period is that democracy became deeper. People became much more involved, not just with voting, but with the control, understanding, and use of government programs, so that this wasn't just power delegated in the hands of bureaucrats or politicians, but it was something that society demanded and society got because it kept its politicians and bureaucrats under control. So therefore, moving forward, if we want to prove Hayek wrong again, which I think is not a luxury, but is a necessity, because without building a better welfare state, without building a better framework for regulating technology, protecting labor, creating opportunities for humans, I think the future is very bleak. And if we want to do that again, we have much to learn about how to make our democracy work. Democracy and regulation are inseparable. We can only have better regulation if we have democracy, and democracy itself thrives in an environment in which people are active and they have opportunities both for economic and political flourishing. Let me stop here, and I'll be more than delighted to have your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daron. Just before we get into some of the questions that are coming in now, you talked about, and you didn't like the word predistribution, and that's what people maybe in social policy talk about, but you have written and you've spoken before about, right now we attempt to try to correct things after the fact, sometimes better than others, some countries better than others. But what you're recommending, or where your evidence takes you, is to be thinking much more upfront about not just social policy, but economic policy, the incentives and disincentives for capital and labor. And that's a fundamentally different way for the development of economic policy in countries like Canada and the United States. I mean, we're just not there yet. So I wouldn't mind if you talked a little bit more about how we might move from where we are now in a country like Canada, which is maybe a little bit more amenable to this than the United States, but how we move from where we are now to a situation where we think more fundamentally upfront about the leveling of the playing field, if not enabling more return to labor and employment.
Thank you, Margaret. And let me actually start by why I said I don't love the word predistribution, though I think I'm not opposed to it. I think the reason why I don't love it is because predistribution versus redistribution creates a dichotomy, but they really are highly complementary. So the image that I want people to have is that a lot of what we can do is shaped by technology, but technology itself is very much our choice and our institutions' choice. So we cannot just think about, let me use progressive taxation or universal basic income, that's going to fix it. Or we cannot just say, oh, it's about predistribution, so we have to just increase wages. They all have to take place together with a focus on what are the technological opportunities, choices, and possibilities for firms. If we have already come to a place where the only game in town is automation, forget about everything else. We're already lost. So that's why a lot of my emphasis has been on we have to redirect technological change towards things that create opportunities, that create possibilities for us. So if you look at the world in the 4 decades following World War II, the amazing achievement in terms of fast productivity growth, fast GDP growth, and inclusive shared prosperity would not have been possible if all we did was introduce more machines and then shed labor from manufacturing. In fact, manufacturing productivity growth and manufacturing employment growth were key drivers of it, and they were complemented by other sectors in non-manufacturing that also created good jobs, secure jobs with high wage and high wage growth. All of these have to come together. So that's why you are right. Canada has it much easier because, for example, protection for labor hasn't been completely decimated in Canada, and that provides a better starting point. But it's not enough because Canada by itself cannot do it. It's actually a global challenge. We as a global community decide where technology goes. US has an oversized effect on this, and so does Europe, so does China. So we have to work together in order to shape the future of work, but the future of technology as well. So some of the important elements of that are starting with a more comprehensive way of thinking about technology. For example, where will a lot of our efforts go in terms of developing new technologies or using AI or robotics? How can we try to use our knowledge in order to create job possibilities and better job, high wage job, good job possibilities for humans? But also, how do we incentivize firms so that they don't go for the cheap road of cheap labor and try to eliminate workers or only keep the lowest paid workers? So you see there the complementarity. If we have technological room, then we can create better jobs by generating incentives for firms not to go for the cheap labor route. So minimum wages, worker protections, union bargaining are much more effective when firms actually need workers. They're completely ineffective if firms are already at the stage where they are eliminating all jobs and you increase wages and you're going to encourage them to eliminate jobs even faster. So you see the complementarities there, and that's why the institutional overhaul that we need is actually quite a critical one. So that's the sense in which the challenge ahead of us is perhaps even more comprehensive than what William Beveridge and other reformers faced. Theirs was a completely virgin territory. So the amount of reform that they imagined and implemented was amazing. But one thing that they did not focus on, because it wasn't so important and so urgent, was the regulation of technology. Well, they were fortunate because it turned out that the welfare state they created did a fairly good job of fighting antitrust and indirectly regulating technology. But that means that today we have an even more formidable challenge because we have to build better labor opportunities, better social insurance, safety net, but at the same time, the very, very difficult task of getting the government to direct technology in the right way, even when some of the largest companies, largest corporate power that the world has ever seen may be pushing in the other direction.
Okay, thank you. We have quite a few questions coming in, some very specific and some actually on some of your big themes. I'm going to start there just for a bit more. So you're questioning, basically what you're recommending or what you're saying what we need to do is going to depend on institutions and inherent policy frameworks and ways of thinking about public policy. And the question then becomes, do we have those institutions or are, for example, the international financial institutions are providing a fair amount of guidance in this area in ways that they didn't even 5 or 10 years ago in terms of rethinking growth pathways. So where do you look for guidance? Where do you think countries can look for guidance in terms of institutions or policy frameworks that actually can change the way in which these issues are debated and discussed in our countries?
A great question. And let me actually say, no, we don't have the institutions. We have to remake them. That's the big part of the challenge ahead of us. But we have some templates when it comes to domestic institutions. It's more severe when it comes to international institutions. For example, for domestic institutions, I think we have a lot to learn from the initial welfare state. Some of the problems that we're dealing with are not dissimilar to what reformers like Beveridge or the Workers' Party in Sweden and later in Norway, Denmark, and Finland were struggling, and German post-war era politicians were struggling with. We also can build on some of the momentum that exists in the European Union, for example, in their ability to do antitrust, which has fallen by the wayside in the United States and to some degree also in Canada and the UK. So there's a lot to learn, but we have to remake those institutions. But I have every confidence that that's actually an achievable task when it comes to domestic institutions. It's much more challenging when it comes to international institutions. Mm-hmm. Because imagine the problem of AI. So what we are talking about is to use AI for good rather than for bad. If you use AI for monitoring dissidents, reading everybody's email so that corporations or governments can create a better surveillance system, or AI as a way of eliminating all but the most menial jobs, would be a bad use of AI. So we can decide in Canada or in the United States, say, not to do that. But what happens if it takes place in Japan or China or the Soviet Russia? So the global regulation of institutions is much, much harder. And we just don't have even the first step there. Sure, we have the IMF and the World Bank and the United Nations, but they neither are up to the task. I don't think they have the realization of the enormity of the challenges. They have much more limited mandates and in many cases limited vision, even if the IMF has sort of progressed a lot from its early days of austerity focus. We just need something much stronger, but even then, you know, institutions are only as good as their ability to enforce and impose certain rules. How are you going to do that in a world of sovereign states that have gone in such different directions and are not even cooperating on most basic things? So I think the challenges there are really is terrifyingly formidable.
So both the Beveridge report, the Marx report in Canada, they were blueprints, if you will, but they weren't all enacted right away, right? It took decades to put all the pieces in place. And so what are the stalking horses, if you will, for the welfare state 3.0? What are the institutions or the first places that you would focus on, either for government? That's the first part of the question, in terms of if you were going to do one thing that might actually begin to build this new institutional fabric and address critical issues. That's one question. The second question would be, we hear a lot about shifting from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, and wouldn't mind your thoughts on that. But what should the private sector itself be doing if it has a role or responsibility in this area?
Well, I think we need to get our hands dirty and get into the details. Let me mention a few things. In the US context, and again, some of those apply to Canada directly, some of them less directly, a couple of first steps are obvious. First, we need much better protection for people. I mean, the poverty, because given the current environment, people are not earning enough for a society that has become so rich that's completely unacceptable, and it actually improves a lot of other incentives for people. Second, our tax system. The fact that we tax capital so little, and labor so much more, that's just an obvious thing to do. A lot of it is things that we have mistakenly done over the last 20 years, and we can undo them very easily. Some of the nice things about it is that, like depreciation allowances, which account for most of the huge declines in capital taxation, are temporary. So they could actually be revoked quite easily, although no government has revoked them. Some of it is tax evasion that, you know, I think broadening the tax base is quite straightforward. But there are other ones that are much more troublesome and difficult. I think part of our problems come from the fact that some corporations have become too big to control, and they do not directly create the problem of low wages, but they create the technological environment in which high-wage jobs become impossible to develop. So if we needed more diversity in the innovations and technologies we develop, we need greater diversity in the companies that set the agenda. So that means that we have to curb corporate power, but it's a very different vision of curbing corporate power. So you hear people saying, you have to break up Amazon because it pays low wages or it doesn't serve the customers. Well, I think the evidence that Amazon doesn't serve the customers is not very easy to find. But it is very easy to find the evidence that Amazon is creating an environment in which work and technology and labor are being squeezed into a corner. And I think those are the sort of the perspectives that we need to bring. We also have to remake our education system. We honestly have in Canada, in the United States, and in Europe, we have an education system that was designed and conceived in the first half of the 20th century, and that's not necessarily appropriate for what we have right now. And I think the fallout from our mistaken education policies are often the greater inequality, because it's the less socially advantaged groups that are really not benefiting from our education policy. So there are many other aspects of this. Certainly government's role in antitrust goes beyond just breaking up the largest tech companies. Government's role in innovation policy. If you look at the most transformative technologies of the last 70, 80 years, the government's fingerprints are all over it. And how did the government play that role? Well, it was a leader in the technological vision, in leading from antibiotics to sensors to airplanes to the internet. But that has completely been given up. It's not unrelated to the increased dominance of a few companies, but it has other causes as well. So again, those are all issues that we have to discuss and get into the business of doing that. And then there, one important one that I meant to say at the beginning, minimum wages. Minimum wages are not a panacea, but I think given the emphasis that I've put on saying, one of the problems is when companies take the low wage path, cheap labor path, minimum wages need to be part of the toolkit of governments to make sure that labor is compensated and doesn't become too cheap a factor that distorts capital's decisions.
Okay, just again, some questions are coming in, many of them. There's questions about how you actually steer the direction of technology. Particularly going back to what you mentioned about the worry that if the state has more control over technology or enterprises, that could become oppressive. On the other hand, corporations and their technology can also be oppressive. It's not just states that can be oppressive.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and let me actually take that up in the context of climate change. And the reason why I want to do that is twofold. First of all, because I think that is another absolutely urgent danger ahead of us, obviously, but it also has very instructive lessons for us. And at least looked at it from this vantage point, it highlights why some of the ideas about how to deal with climate change are mistaken. So let me take it exactly where you've mentioned it. So let me sort of think of two polar policies. One is we let the market deal with climate without much involvement from the government. Perhaps some basic EPA policies, Environmental Protection Agency in the US. That's not going to be sufficient. Why not? Well, because the market is not going to have an incentive to either reduce carbon emissions, because each firm is going to think about its bottom line and not about the global emissions that they are creating. And the market is not going to have the incentives to invest in cleaner, greener technologies. But the other polar opposite, which is a combination of extreme Green New Deal or the Club of Rome give up on growth, is also not realistic. Why not? Well, first of all, if you make the government take control of all of the technologies, that's going to walk right into the Hayekian trap. The government has had great successes in being a leader in technology, but it hasn't had great successes in being the full developer and implementers of technology. The government has been successful when it's a partner. And when we turn our back on growth, that's not going to cut it either. You see what happens when even a little slowdown in growth generates all of these political and social backlash. If we turn our back on growth, the amount of political upheaval that's going to create is actually scary. And moreover, when we turn our back on growth, we're often turning our back on technology, which is definitely not the solution. So then how do we deal with climate change? Well, actually, again, we've got a template for it. If you look at the last 40 years, our record on dealing with climate change is not a complete failure. There are huge mistakes we've made, but on the whole, if you compare the state of technology today to what we had 35 to 40 years ago, it's a sea change. 40 years ago, we had no green technology that was competitive with coal and oil. Today, many clean technologies are essentially cost effective. How has that happened? Well, it's happened because the government hasn't been the one to decide what technologies to use, but it has provided the right regulatory framework in many parts of the world. In the United States, there has been a lot of subsidies to clean energy. And in Europe, there has been both carbon pricing and plenty of subsidies to green technology. So as a result, there has been tremendous advances in geothermal, wind and solar energy, as well as in various types of carbon filtering, carbon sequestration, and so on. So a combination of these things is that we are actually within reach to be able to create an energy transition where with the right leadership and the right policies within the next 20 years, we can come close to zero carbon emissions. So that shows the template that we have to think about redirecting technological change. It is that the government has to play a robust role, but by providing the framework and the incentives for the market economy regulated properly to take the technology in the right direction. And that's exactly what we need to do with AI. We don't need the government to be the one who does the AI technologies. That's the wrong vision. But we also don't need the government to say, okay, whatever we do with AI, that's fine. Or it's even worse. The government right now in China and to some degree in the United States is encouraging the AI technologies to go in the direction of face recognition, monitoring, and snooping. So it's exactly the opposite that we need to do from the government. The right types of technologies to be demanded and to be supported.
And let me just shift that. Thank you very much for all of that. And let me just shift a little bit. I mean, we have these overlapping and intersecting crises and dynamics right now. I'm glad you introduced climate. We also have a crisis that has disproportionately affected racialized communities, both in terms of the health impact and who's working on the front lines, in addition to the dynamics around Black Lives Matter and systemic racism. So I know this is a little bit of a different set of issues, but it's part of the reality that we're facing, and that needs to be addressed as part of thinking about, like, the welfare state 1.0 was designed at a different time for a different set of conditions, I guess, and left out a lot of people systematically. So any thoughts on that part?
Well, I mean, I think that's a complex set of issues, but what I can certainly say is that part of the reason why the welfare state has always been imperfect and very partial in the United States is the race problem. So the federal state has never been powerful or determined to protect the most discriminated against parts of society, which are the minorities in the United States. That has several reasons, but it does go back in history to the US Constitution, to the problem of slavery, to the problem of the federal state being his powers being hemmed in order to allow the Southern slavery problem to continue in the way that it did at the time of the signing of the US Constitution. And I think moving forward, that is a formidable challenge, because after 250 years of today what we call structural racism, or whatever you want to call it, the problem of race is very difficult to change. You cannot do it without tackling discrimination in the criminal system. You cannot do it without tackling discrimination in the education system. You cannot do it without dealing with the lasting, continuing effects of discrimination in the labor market. But it's also deeper than that. Segregation, communities, family structure, and all of these come in. So I think that's one of the more challenging problems. But a true welfare state, and this is part of the reason why US has been somewhere in the gray area when it comes to the welfare state. A true welfare state would not leave 20% of its population out of its coverage. And because of the compromises that the US has had to make when developing its welfare state, because of this history that I've mentioned extremely briefly, the US did so to some degree, going back to Woodrow Wilson's early segregationist racist policies, FDR's compromises, LBJ's compromises. They all meant that the progress on dealing with race issues have been more imperfect and more partial than would have been ideally the case.
Thanks again. Just shifting a little bit, drawing into some of the things you talked about from the narrow corridor and the balance, the journey, the joined up journey between state and societies, and how you find that sweet spot. And the question of what we're seeing in some other countries about a rise of more autocratic tendencies, sort of autocratic populism, I think is the way Pippa Norris would call it. And obviously that you allude to that in your comments. To what extent, if you, again, thinking about that challenge, where would that lead you in terms of advising policymakers or decision makers in the private sector in terms of a first step to try to minimize, it goes to the your very first slide and first couple slides about who's been disenfranchised and who's being left behind. So I just wondered if you could just say a few more thoughts about linking it up to that issue about populism and where we go from here.
Of course, I think that's really central. I would definitely put the decline, reversal, retrenchment of democracy at the same level in terms of the dangers that we're facing, together with the future of work, the future of lack of good jobs, and the climate change and future pandemics. I think those are all existential challenges. And unfortunately, these are all difficult problems to deal with. Fortunately, they're all related. And I think the answer I have is that, strengthening our democracy is actually a very effective way of dealing with all of these problems. It's not easy. And when the Great Depression hit, it certainly was the main factor that pushed the Swedish people to elect an until then left out of power party, the Swedish Workers' Party, to start the process of building something like the Swedish welfare state. But at the same time, the Great Depression brought the Nazis into power in Germany and came close to bringing an extreme right-wing government to power in France and several other European countries. So, and today, I don't think it is a coincidence that we have at least 20 countries that have gone in a much more around the world, not just in the Western world, but have gone in a much more authoritarian populist direction. From Brazil to the US and the UK, to the Philippines, to Turkey, to Hungary, to Poland, there are commonalities, and those commonalities are indeed related to the strains, economic and social, that globalization and automation are creating. And the way you deal with them is not preordained in the same way that the technology's future is not preordained. Again, the divergent reactions of Sweden and Germany to the Great Depression, to the hardships created by the Great Depression, shows you can have very different responses to emergencies and to hardships. And I think we have to make sure that we take the path towards strengthening our democracy, because that then enables a much greater set of options for us to deal with the technology's challenges, pandemics challenges, climate change's challenges, and of course, it's a very, very important part of protecting our liberty and our basic democratic and human rights. And I think we have a lot to learn from Canada in this respect. But I think in every country, the democratic forces are not defeated. In some of them, they may be in difficult position, but the demand for democracy is still true. From the UK to the US to France to the Philippines, there are a lot of democratic movements. But how to actually turn them into a coalition that can govern, and how to actually stop the authoritarian populist machine in these countries from sort of claiming power and grabbing power and maintaining power once they've grabbed it, I think those are very, very difficult questions. I think there we really need to get into the details. The problem in the UK is completely different from that in the US. There is no danger of forceful grabbing of power in the UK, but there are a lot of populist, misguided policies. In the US, there are bigger dangers. In Brazil, there are even bigger dangers. So there are a lot of issues that we have to sort of grapple with. But my belief, based on evidence, historical evidence and others, but also partly a belief, is that doubling down on democracy is the only way forward here.
Thank you. Well, that's actually a really important way to sort of wrap up. I think we're coming to the close, and I wanted to give you a chance just to say any final words you have. I mean, over the conference, we're going to drill down even more in terms of the impacts of the crisis on various demographics, generations, communities, sectors, racialized communities, indigenous populations in Canada, probably in the United States as well. And then we're going to look at income security. We're going to look at, I'm sure some of the issues you raised will come on the table. The care economy, which is both the issues around caregiving and who's giving the caregiving, and also the extent to which we actually value the care provision, and also labor protections. One thing we haven't really talked about is how we've all been very sympathetic and empathetic and supporting our frontline workers and our grocery clerks and people who are there at night doing worker sanitation of our streets, et cetera, who are often more marginalized people. We care about them briefly, but we don't really value what they do. And so I know that's a huge question, but I just thought that might be something that you might want to comment on.
Yeah, well, I think that, thank you for ending with that, Margaret. Let me make 3 points. First of all, many of the questions that you've asked are about the nature of work and what opportunities to a diverse set of people, communities, work, and the labor market provides. I think that's my focus, and I think it's great that that's going to be the focus of both thoughts and policymaking in Canada. Second, the main point that I want people, if they're going to take anything away from this talk, is the following. A lot of this is our choice. There is no inevitable path of democracy. There is no inevitable path of climate change. There is no inevitable path of democracy or collapse of democracy. There's a lot at stake, and it's all up for grabs. And then the final point that I want to remind people is that it's also a vision thing. What's the right vision that we need to have? If you look at from the point of view of the long durée of history, the 4 or 5 decades that followed 1945 were the most amazing for humanity. That's the period during which the world economy grew fastest. There've never been any other period during which the world economy grew that fast. Its technology became completely revolutionized. It became much greater, much more democratized in many ways. And as the data that I showed you, and you can replicate that for other countries, for Canada, for Western Europe, for Japan, for South Korea, inequality actually declined or remained stable in most of the world, in most of the developed world at least. Now, there are two visions that you can have. One is that that was an aberration and the future is as bleak as it was in the Middle Ages. Or the second one is that that was a replicable period that we can again create if we make the right institutional choices. I strongly believe in the second, but that it's very important to have that vision and learn what lessons we can learn and adapt them to the changing global, technological, and social environment that we are facing today.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I think you've given us so much food for thought and a challenge, not just to those of us who are participating in this conference, but to our citizenry and our societies about the choices that we make, and that it's not all inevitable and predestined, that we can actually influence the path forward. So thank you very much to Professor Acemoglu, who's given us so much to think about over the next 3 weeks. I'd like to also thank, we had upwards of 40 questions and we kind of grouped them and we didn't get to all of you, but great questions, and thank you all very much for sending in very thoughtful questions and comments. I'm going to just give a preview of coming attractions. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we're going to pick up on many of these points and that were put on the table today. And we're going to look at what we know in more detail a bit about what the pandemic's impact has been on different OECD countries, their economies, their sectors, their people, their citizens, their generations, and also what we can learn from the diverse range of policy responses that OECD countries have put into place in Canada. We're going to hear from Stefano Scarpetta, who's the Director of Employment, Labor and Social Affairs at the OECD, and Kevin Milligan, who's a Professor of Economics at the Vancouver School of Economics at the UBC. So we'll be at 12 noon tomorrow. For those of you who are registered, please just sign on using the unique URL that you have received in your confirmation email. And it's the same link as you used today, and it's the same link that you use for all your sessions. So we're off to a tremendous start. And before closing, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, Employment and Social Development Canada, the Ministry and Community of Social Services in Ontario, and the City of Toronto. It's an experiment to put on an online conference like this. Without their support, we would not be able to bring these critical issues and all these leading experts to this large virtual event. So a huge thank you for that. Again, Professor Acemoglu, thank you so much for getting us started, and thanks to everybody for participating.
Thank you very much. It was great to be here, and thanks for all the questions.